Hi everybody, Mr. Wyatt here. And as you know, we have a test coming up tomorrow. So today we are doing some review. And so I'm going through some examples. I'm going through all the examples actually from your review assignment. And so we're going to start here looking at number 1. What percent of this figure is shaded purple? Well, I think the first thing that we need to remember is that percent means per 100. So when I look at this grid here, this grid should have 100 squares in it. Otherwise, we're going to have to think about it more closely in terms of figuring out the percent. So let's see if it is 10 wide and if it's 10 high. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay, it has a width of 10. And then the height, 1, 2, 3. Oops, I'm writing all of a sudden. Don't want to do that. And there we go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. It is 10 high as well. Okay, so if you take the length times the width, 10 times 10 does equal 100. So we have 100 squares here. Now, if you want to know the percent then, which means per 100, you could count the columns here. We have one column here, so that's 10 squares. I'm going to count by tens. 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, and I'm going to stop right there and put a box around these 50 squares. Okay, this is 50 squares right here. It's 1/2 of this entire grid. Okay, but then over here I see I have 1, 2, 3, 4 more squares. So we have a total of 54 squares that are shaded purple here out of the 100 squares total. So what percent of this figure is shaded purple? Well, that would be 54%. All right, so that's how you do a problem like this. Oh, and by the way, if 54% of it is shaded, I wonder what percent is unshaded. Well, you could take 54 and subtract it from 100 and figure out what the difference would be. 100 minus 54 will equal 46. You can see you can make this 10 here into a 9, and this becomes 10. 10 minus 4 is 6. 9 minus 5 is 4. So we have 54% that's shaded, and we have 46% that's unshaded. These two together total 100%. But to answer the question, what percent of this figure is shaded purple? 54%. You just count up the squares. All right, number 2, if the Minnesota Vikings won 12 out of 16 games one season, well, we know it won't be this season, right? But if they won 12 out of 16 games one season, what percent of their games did they win? So we have 12 out of 16. I'm going to write that in fractional form, 12 out of 16. And so what I need to do is, if I want to figure out the percent, I need to figure out what this would be out of 100. If you can figure out, I'll put a P here for the missing percent. If we can figure out what it is out of 100, then we'll have our percent. 16 and 100 are not compatible values. So I'm not going to be able to figure out what to multiply by 16 to get to 100. Well, actually I could. I mean, I could multiply by what would be 8.25, I suppose. But that's not very convenient. So we have other options. We could use cross multiplying. We could take 100 times 12, which would be 1,200. We could take 16 times p, 16p, and then we could just solve that by dividing 12 or 1,200 by 16 and see what we get for an answer. But I'm going to show you something here that's going to make this problem a lot easier. Do you notice that 12/16 isn't simplified all the way? I could actually simplify that ratio because 12 and 16 are both divisible by 4. So I'm just looking at this right now, and I'm going to divide both the top and the bottom by 4. 12 divided by 4 is 3. 16 divided by 4 is 4. So if you simplify that fraction, that's 3/4. So the Vikings that year won 3/4 of their games. Now can you figure out what that would be out of 100? You might even know what 3/4 is. as a percent. You know, 4 does go nicely into 100 if you multiply by 25. 4 times 25 is 100. So just take 3 times 25. And we find out we get 75 out of 100, which means they won 75% of their games. Okay? Now, there is another way to do this, especially if you're able to use a calculator. You might want to pay attention to this. We're talking about the Vikings, so I'm going to switch to purple here. 12 out of 16 games. They won 12 out of 16 games. If you want to find this as a percent and you have a calculator, the easiest way to do this is to remember that fractions are division problems. Just divide 12 by 16. Yes, it's 12 divided by 16. I know 12 is smaller than 16, but that's okay. We'll get a decimal. When you divide 12 by 16, it's 0.75 or 75 hundredths as a decimal. And to change that into a percent, just move the decimal point to the right 2 spaces. And you get 75%. Okay? So, yes, you can use a calculator on the test tomorrow. So on a problem like this, yeah, just go ahead and divide 12 by 16. Use your calculator. It's 0.75, and then change that into a percent by moving the decimal point to the right 2 spaces. All right, number 3, if segment AB, as pictured here, represents 100%, then what is the length of a line segment that is 10%? Okay, so segment AB represents 100%. If I'm looking for a segment that is 10%, that would be shorter than this, right? In fact, it would take 10 of these to equal the length of segment AB, okay? 10% as a fraction is 1/10. And if you want to find 1/10 of something, you just divide it by 10. So if 5 feet is 100%, then 10% would be 5 feet divided by 10. You know, when I write my division problem this way, it looks like a fraction, doesn't it? And 5/10 is 1/2, isn't it? So we could think of our answer as being 1/2 of a foot. But if you divide 5 by 10, and again, you can use a calculator to do this, you will get 0.5, which is 1/2. So it's 5/10 of a foot. When you're dividing by 10, you just take the decimal point and you move it left 1 space. So it's 5/10 of a foot. It's half of a foot. Okay, so the length of a line segment that is 10% of the length of this would be half a foot or 5/10 of a foot. Number 4, write 0.2% as a decimal. Now be careful, because some people look and say, well, I have a decimal here, so there it must just be 0.2 or 2/10. But be careful, because this is a percent right now. To change percents into decimals, you move the decimal point to the left 2 spaces. What you're doing is you're dividing by 100 when you do that. Every time you move 1 space, you're dividing by 10. So whoop, whoop, move 2 spaces to the left, fill those spaces with zeros. Our decimal equivalent is 0.002. I like to put a 0 out in front of that as well. 2 thousandths, 2 out of 1,000. Okay, easy, right? Number 5, write 5/8 as a decimal. All right, so 5/8 is a fraction. And you can always change fractions into decimals by just dividing, as long as you remember that fractions are division problems. So we're going to take 5, we're going to divide it by 8. Again, I know 8 is larger than 5, but if you add a decimal point and some zeros, you'll be able to do this. Again, though, just use your calculators. Take 5 divided by 8 equals, and enter it in that order in your calculator. 5 divided by 8 equals, and it's going to be 0.625. Okay. By the way, I did not do that mentally. I have the eighths memorized because they're very common. If you did this by hand, 8 times 6 is 48. You'd get a remainder of 2. I got to clear this out here. And let's see here, bring down a 0. 8 times 2 is 16. Subtract that from 20, we get a remainder of 4, bring down a 0. And 8 times 5 is 40. And we get our remainder of 0 here. So you can see we get 0.625 when we divide it by hand as well. But you can use a calculator. All right, number 6. Kyera earned $120 babysitting. She saved 20% of her money. Find how much she saved. The easiest way to do this problem is we have $120. You could find 10% of that very quickly by just moving the decimal point left one space. Remember, that's how you find 10% of something. You just divide by 10. 10% is $12. Now remember, she saved 20% of her money. If 10% is $12, you could find 20% by doubling that or multiplying by 2. So just take $12 and multiply by 2, and you get $24. So that's a little trick you could use to do this type of problem mentally. Just find 10% and then double it to get your 20%. Otherwise, if you want to find out what 20% of 120 is, then take 120 and multiply by whatever 20% is in decimal form. Now again, 20%, pay attention to where the decimal point is. It isn't shown, so it must be at the end of the number. To change it into a decimal, move 2 spaces to the left, whoop, whoop, and you get 0.20, or simply 0.2. And you can use a calculator and take 120 times 0.2, the decimal version of 20%. And that comes out to 24.0. We're working with money, so that would be $24. And I know money usually shows 2 places past the decimal point. So that's how you do number 6. Number 7, write 375% as a fraction and as a decimal. Percent means per 100, so if you want this as a fraction, just put 375 over 100 and you have your fraction. Of course, that's not in simplest terms. We're going to want to simplify this. And you know what goes into both these numbers is 25. We can divide them both by 25. And we get 15 over 4. Okay, so there it is as a fraction. Now, if you want, you can change that to a mixed number by dividing 15 by 4. 15 divided by 4. 4 times 3 is 12. We get a remainder of 3. Oops. We get a remainder of 3. So it's 3 3/4 as a mixed number. Now, changing it into a decimal is actually a lot easier. 375%. Remember, to change a percent to a decimal, you find the decimal point. It's not shown, so it's at the end of the number. And move it 2 spaces to the left. It's 3.75 in decimal form. Okay? And then number 8, very quickly, write 0.7% as a fraction and as a decimal. The very first thing I would do is just rewrite the 0.7 here in decimal form by taking 7 dividing by 10. This is how it would look as a decimal. That's 0.7%. So as a decimal, that's the easy part. Just move this 2 spaces to the left to change it from a percent to a decimal. And we get 0.007 or 7 thousandths. Okay? Now, once it's written in decimal form, it's easy to write it as a fraction because the 7 is in the thousandths place. So as a fraction, it's 7 over 1,000. All right, I'll see you later.